Hello, I'm Tristan McGough, and today I'm going to talk to you about enlightenment, emancipation, empowerment, and endearment, which are the fruits of self-transformation. Any liberation presumes change. Whatever you call it, whether it's emancipation, liberation, or salvation, if liberation is freedom from suffering and the attainment of happiness, that means a change in the state, and it's a necessary change from the present suffering-prone condition to something more benefic. Making that change consciously is a process called self-transformation. And the basic formula is this. Self-transformation equals two things, self-realization and self-cultivation. The center of transformation is oneself. Here, truth is your refuge, and your refuge is yourself. In the words of the Buddha, speaking to his faithful students, he said, Ananda, therefore, be ye lamps unto yourselves. Be ye a refuge to yourselves. Betake yourselves to no external refuge. Hold fast to the truth as a lamp. Hold fast to the truth as a refuge. Look not to a refuge in anyone besides yourself, and those, Ananda, who either now or after I am dead shall be a lamp unto themselves, shall betake themselves to no external refuge, but holding fast to the truth as the lamp, and holding fast to the truth as their refuge, shall not look for refuge to anyone besides themselves. It is they who shall reach the very topmost height, but they must be anxious to learn. The goal, the wish, the dream of us all, everyone wants freedom from suffering and the attainment of happiness. There is a universal, innate life goal amongst all people, no matter their religious persuasion or their political point of view, or their attained level of economic prosperity. And that's despite all the limitations. People want happiness with an end to sorrow, even as they confront their own slavish preoccupation with worldly demands, personal, familial, occupational, and social. They're also wrestling with no real sense of life purpose and dwelling without a sense of inner peace. And their limitations in spite of their blindly accepted, indoctrinated beliefs, deep-seated prejudices toward or hatred of other people or peoples, other points of view or other lifestyles, an unquestioned conceit and false sense of confidence. How do you get past all these worldly demands, personal flaws, and blind adherence to one's own personal biases, opinions, passions, urges, hidden imperatives, and limited egocentric point of view that constrains and colors every experience? Cutting to the chase, as the Buddha said in translation, you need to let that shit go. That means all of it. All your worrying of how you go about your life and your business in the world, your present state of anxiety, your sense of purposelessness. Let go of your self-centered conceits and the concept about others and yourself. You need to give others a break, including yourself, because, as the Buddha clarified, if your compassion doesn't include yourself, it is incomplete. But being happy and leaving suffering behind is hardly an individual affair conducted in isolation from one's life world. The actual world in which we live is never in isolation. It's the world in which we wormhole ourselves through the tunnel of space and time. It's all about a changing to a better state of mind when dealing with a changing world of interdependent people, as well as the grand menagerie of other sentient beings in the cosmos, plus all the things that we all generate together while we're interacting with one another. Yes, happiness is an interdependent affair, and so being, it involves all the dimensions of yourself: personal, interpersonal, co-personal, and transpersonal. So how does anyone discover the keys to happiness? You won't know until you look. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. In other terms, to fully value life, you need to do what you are as a human being. Among other things, you're a thinking being. Some even say rational being. Therefore, thinking about things rationally is doing what a human being, as a rational being, does. By examining your life, you intrinsically make it more valuable because you are actualizing your rational potential, bringing to light new aspects of yourself, your being, and your relationship to the world and to others. The more you can understand something or someone and your own life, the deeper you are able to value the unique part you play in the world. Socrates was also the one that pointed out that in order to become happy, you first had to be wise. And to become wise, you had to follow the advice of the Delphic oracle, who said, "Man, know thyself." How deep do we know ourselves? Well, Friedrich Nietzsche, in his book On the Genealogy of Morals, said, "We are unknown, we knowers, ourselves to ourselves." In other words, according to Nietzsche, we don't know much about ourselves. In fact, he says we're unknown to ourselves. As knowledge is the antidote to ignorance, wisdom is the antidote to existential stupidity, which is nothing more than acting on your ignorance. To become wise, you need to know the self. And there are two senses of knowing the self: self-knowledge, capital S, capital K, and self-knowledge, small s, small k. And both kinds of self-knowledge are necessary to cultivate that wisdom, which at once is the discovery of happiness and end to suffering. Let's go over the two meanings of knowledge of the self, with and without capital letters. With capitals S and K, self-knowledge is knowing the oneness of self. Whether that self is without characteristics, in its pure, unchanging, unlimited, and illimitable ground of the transcendental self, or while remaining untouched and unchanging as the transcendent absolute self, whether that self manifests with characteristics as immanent selves, reflected in the personal ego through each consciousness's finite filters of the world. With small letters, self-knowledge is direct, immediate. It's knowledge of oneself in one of its modes of appearing to your own conscious mind, as a dimension, as it were, of your immanent, individualized, relativized self, the mental event, belonging to the continuum of your own personal consciousness. The union of both types of knowledge is liberation. Liberation from suffering is attained through the wisdom that comes from self-knowledge in both forms, as knowledge of the one self and knowledge of oneself. Shankara, the great 8th century Indian philosopher who synthesized the non-dual Advaita Vedanta school, particular view of the cosmos, he said, "Talk as much philosophy as you please, worship as many gods as you like, observe all the ceremonies, sing devoted praises to any number of divine beings. liberation never comes, even at the end of 100 aeons, without realization of the oneness of self. So here's the dual goal immediately of self-realization. Ultimate happiness is dependent on discovering oneness of self through our conscious union with the ground of being, sometimes personified as God. The more you consciously at one yourself with what you share with the whole world by way of fundamental being, the more blissful you'll be. Nonetheless, your relative happiness is this multidimensional world of finite forms, whether they be physical, emotional, intellectual, intuitional, volitional, perceptual. That's all dependent on knowing your finite self in all your many relative dimensions. The self is not one-dimensional, thereby establishing harmony here on earth as it is in the heaven of the oneness of self, where bliss reigns without effort. Together, these dimensions reveal the absolute universal self and the relative individual self. The finite psychophysical self, relative to all others, has 10 dimensions of identity. In brief, the self is able to identify with the following, taking on, as it were, a bodily self. And that has two aspects. That's your sensory self. That's the self that has the usual five senses plus your sense of equilibrium in the world and where your position is in your kinesthetic activities. And then there's the active bodily sense, such as I know when I'm moving my hand, I know when I'm speaking, I know when I'm blinking my eyes, I know when I'm circumambulating, walking about the room, I know when I rise and when I sit. These are active bodily senses, just as you have passive bodily senses. Either way, the bodily self is the sense of identity that you are your body in some way or another, or that you're in your body, or that your body's in you, or that your body's a part of you. But the second dimension to self is a unique one to us all, totally. It's our perspective on the world. It's our observing self. It's our perspectival self. It's the view we have from the vantage point, not only physically from our eyes and auditorially from our ears, but it's also our mental perspective on the world, our emotional take of the world. We have a unique perspective, and that's our observing self, as the first dimension of self is the bodily, or sensory and active self, the living self. The third self, the third dimension of self, is the emotional self. And that's the subjective experience of feeling emotionally. You have unique emotions. You cling to a web of beliefs and sentiments, habits, and commitments. And these are all unique to you, and these are something that are felt and experienced as a feeling. And this is your feeling self, your emotional self. You also have a narrating self, and that's the self that's always going on in the interpsychic dialogue, where you hear yourself speaking to yourself, and that dialogue narrates the world. That's your thinking self. You also have a volitional self, a self that asserts itself in the world and decides that it's going to do this rather than that, or that it's mandatory, or it takes a vow and it adheres to that vow. That's your volitional self. That's your willing self. And these are all dimensions that are open for your discovery through self-reflection. There's also a social self. And that's the way you think that you appear in others' minds. What you think they hold of you. the opinions they hold of you, the views they hold of you. It's your social self. And actually, that's how you develop your imagination. It's your imagining self. You're taking perspectives that you don't own as a perspectival self, but as a social self, you look at things from what you think are their point of view. And that has a lot to do with ego construction and how we as egos are constructed empirically in this world through social experience. But we'll go into that at another time. Then there's the continuing self, which is the self we all have when we wake up to in the morning. We don't walk into some room we're unfamiliar with as with a different self. We walk from one room to another with the same self. This is a continuing self. Even when we go to sleep, we wake up, we're convinced that we continue with a sense of identity, which is unique to us. This is your continuing self. Or, if you like, the enduring self. But then there's a unifying self. That's the self that sits here right now. It integrates what I'm saying with what I'm feeling, with what I'm thinking, with what I'm willing, with what I'm perceiving, with what I experience bodily. This is not something which is just a bodily self or just an emotional self. This is a sense of organic unity. This is the organizing self. This is the unifying self. This is the eighth dimension of self. The ninth is the advancing self. That's the self that's ever transitioning, taking continuity for granted, not just as a continuing self, but as a self that binds together a past that has happened with a future which has yet to begin, yet is forever beginning in the moment. It's forever advancing. It's on a one-dimensional pursuit to infinity. It never stops unrolling. This is your advancing or your presenting self. And the 10th dimension is your identifying self. That's the self that's generated and that's sensed as all the other 9 dimensions. That's the self, the identifying self, that allows you to experience a bodily self, a perspectival self, an emotional self, a thinking self, a willing self, a continuing self, a unifying self, and an advancing self. It's the self that's forever opening up the present as a gift, which we'll go into as another time. But that's the ever-unfolding present moment that is always a gift of the universe to you. And this is the one self. Now, paying attention to these modes leads to the transcendent relative self-knowledge we were talking about. Being and staying conscious in your daily activities, mental and behavioral, leads to self-knowledge. The key is given by Sri Buddharaja, who is a 10th century non-dualistic Trika Shaivist who believed fundamentally that the unmanifest and the manifest universe were one and the same, the way the Buddhists speak of nirvana and form being one and the same. And this is from his attainment of one's own awareness. He says, the method of attaining the goal is to be constantly awake to one's own awareness. By this means, the yogi achieves the state free from differentiation. It is by this means alone that one stays awake to one's own being. Through this, the yogi achieves joy and rests in the self. Resting in the self is not resting on your laurels. Realizing the depth and dimensions of yourself, in both senses, will become the actual basis for you to transform your consciousness from suffering into happiness. The harmonizing of the 10 dimensions of self through self-reflection, self-observation, self-realization, and self-cultivation is happiness. Happiness is nothing but the harmony amongst yourself's 10 dimensions, all uniquely developed by you in conscious self-cultivation. So, what to cultivate? Well, cultivate wisdom through clear awareness of who you are in all your dimensions. Secondly, cultivate virtue, which is the strengthening of character. And that's another name for your enduring psychological aspects, abilities, and aptitudes of your evolved efforts. Cultivate skills, which are the numerous talents you've developed through one of the 10 types of human intelligence. Remember, there are 10 types. There's visual, which is picture or artistic smarts. You've got linguistic, which is word smarts. Logical, which is number and reasoning smarts. Kinesthetic, like athlete, which is body smart. Naturalist, like ecologist, that's nature smart. Musical, that's sound smart. Existential, life smart. Interpersonal is people smart. Intrapersonal is that you're self smart. You know about yourself. You know about yourself in its 10 dimensions. And then there's transpersonal, which we'll call cosmos smart. And the fourth thing to cultivate is serenity. By treating all sentient beings as ends in themselves, all having equal precious value, which you cherish as much as your own life. So what gets grown when you cultivate your garden of self-consciousness and self-realization? Well, the seeds of wisdom that you sow ripen into enlightenment. The seeds of virtue that you sow ripen into empowerment. The seeds of skills you sown ripen into emancipation. And the seeds of serenity you sow ripen into endearment. This is all self-transformation. One's basis of self-experience is self-consciousness. Through self-realization and self-cultivation, sometimes called self-actualization, like by Abraham Maslow, the famed psychologist, one transforms oneself, moving from suffering to happiness. The enlightening mind, empowering will, emancipating life, and endearing love, these are the fruits of transformation that continue this consciousness, transformation into one's self-evolution, where dimensional growth is harmonic expansion into the cosmos. We have a final word from the rishis, the seers of the Himalayas, speaking in the Katha Upanishad, which says, "The self is not realizable by study, nor even by intelligence and learning. The self reveals its essence only to him who applies himself to the self. He who has not given up on the ways of vice, who cannot control himself, who is not at peace within, whose mind is distracted, can never realize the self, though full of all the learning in the world." Today I'll leave you with just a 2-part short instruction into self-realization in its 2 forms. For self-realization in the finite form of you as a human being in your everyday environment, that is with the small s and the small r, turn your everyday awareness into focused conscious knowing by calling to mind this formula: I am conscious of being conscious. Then, whatever you are conscious of from within those 10 dimensions of yourself, where You have self-identification and manifestation. Observe closely, being mindful of and clearly discerning the phenomena and their transformations before you. Whether it's a sensation, perspective, thought, feeling, deed, intention, intuition, or thing. And as for self-realization of the oneness of all, ask yourself, who am I? Behave, be good, but above all, be yourself.